条約は被爆者の願いそのものです。
The treaty embodies this very aspiration of we Hibakusha.
締約国会議の成功を心から願っております。
If my grandmother had not been evacuated at that time, if she had been more affected by radiation and died soon after the bombing, I would not be here today.
Are mostly sent off island to other countries for cancer treatment. Others are left untreated or undiagnosed until they find themselves in the late stages of their diseases and their life.
As the guardian of international humanitarian law. The ICRC was also the first international humanitarian relief organization to come to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the immediate aftermath of the 2 atomic bomb explosions.
The impact of the nuclear bomb on healthcare workers was shocking. 90% of the doctors were killed or injured, as were 92% of the nurses and 80% of the pharmacists. There was a desperate need for blood, but there was no possibility of blood transfusions, as most potential donors were either dead or injured. The destructive power of nuclear weapons has increased dramatically, but the ability of states and international agencies to assist the victims has not. Perceived or real national security threats cannot be an excuse to further delay taking effective risk reduction measures and nuclear disarmament measures. On the contrary, the very survival of humanity from such unacceptable risks is a matter of priority and urgency.
Water, sanitation and infrastructure, logistics as well. Inside the blast zone, roads, rail links and tunnels will be impassable. And beyond the blast zone, there will be significant problems with abandoned vehicles as well.
But what has changed, of course, in the meantime, is the risk. Nuclear risks are very high today.
Where are the Stanislav Petrovs, the Gervais Karls, the Vasily Archipovs, and the Leonid Peruts today? Is there a Stanislav Petrov in North Korea that we can rely on? Would they, this wonderful person who has this interesting brain, who thinks differently, would they have the authority or the courage to do what Stanislav Petrov did in 1983? Is there Gordievsky right now in Russia? President Putin still doesn't like Mr. Gordievsky. Or is there Vasily Arkhipov on a Russian submarine right now, worried to death about these threats that are coming from Moscow? We're in one of the most dangerous situations re nuclear weapons since the end of the Cold War. We actually, the thing that dominates in this equation in a crisis is uncertainty. It's unknown what the probabilities are. And that's what we have to come to grips with. But we do know that in a crisis, the probabilities of use will increase. That's clear. If history is a guide, what we have to do right now is hope, pray, that humanity's luck will hold. And that somewhere right now, in the nuclear weapons possessing countries, particularly in those that are making threats right now today, overt nuclear threats, that there are people who are smart, who are courageous, and they are in positions where they can act to prevent the use of nuclear weapons.
Girls in this youngest age group were twice as likely to get cancer at some point in the next 60 years than were boys. For every male in the birth to 5-year cohort that suffered cancer, 2 females got cancer. This is not all childhood cancer, it is total incidence. And it is easy to see that females suffered more cancer than males in every age group, and the difference is greatest when the exposure is in childhood. The future is in our hands. I want to thank this community for all the work you do and for moving this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your tweet. Mr. Terasaki.
And thank you for being co-organizers of our site event.
Very honor. サイドイベントでは局長がお話しされますか？
Are you going to give a speech at the side event?
Just remarks at the beginning.
I see. じゃあ最初のところでちょっとご挨拶する予定です。
ああ、そうですか。わかりました。Oh, thank you so much.
Very in touch. Terasaki-san?
Yes, to meet you. 2018
Vienna.
またその時よろしくお願いします。Thank you so much. 日本語大丈夫です。
日本人。
我々は同じエイジアプレイス。
Christian, you know Christian?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Nuclear Age Foundation.
Yeah.
And
Can he deliver?
At our side event, you are very welcome tomorrow in this building.
Short speech.
Yeah?
He's the president.
Yes, Dr. Vanna here.
It is probably true that people are really frustrated because within that framework we did not see a progress in nuclear disarmament. But that's why we have to reactivate the NPT. Now, in all of that, I think the humanitarian approaches actually do help enormously. I already mentioned earlier today the history of humanitarian approaches that made an enormous impact in overall disarmament efforts, all the way going back to the St. Petersburg Declaration. So it is a very important part of our normative developments, international law developments. Humanitarian considerations always drove that strong movement as a human society. Across the regions, across various groups, nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, and different regions, they see the humanitarian consequences and also the risk factor as a common ground. And therefore, in the August NPT, I hope that this will also become one of the convergences, and from there, there will be an actual progress that we could start building on. You know, tomorrow we will have a very important first meeting of states parties, and I'm really looking forward to that. But I hope we will all agree that TPNW is not the end point. Our end point must be the elimination of nuclear weapons.
Disarmament education to raise the public's awareness of the inhumane and devastating consequences of nuclear weapons, especially through sharing the testimony of the Hibakusha. I'd like to reiterate our further commitment to promote peace and disarmament education, and also ask for your valuable input as to how best to continue raising awareness about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in a most effective manner. Thank you so much.
Disarmament education, I think, there is a renewed highlights on that. Not least because what I call the lived experience of survivors will be, will no longer be there to directly engage with as the time passes, and then we have to absolutely make sure that this will be passed on, because it really gives a strong motivation and understanding why we have to move towards elimination. But there is also a couple of other reasons why we need to. One is that so much, as captured by also Patricia, so much have changed in the overall international peace and security context. In the direct disarmament field also, just to name a few, emergence of science and technology, new technology rapidly developing, so that the multilateral processes are not really catching up. There are new issues that we need to understand and tackle. That's another very strong reason why we need to focus on disarmament education. There are new domains that are not sufficiently governed cyberspace and outer space. These will actually touch on how nuclear weapon risks might be exacerbated. So there are a whole range of reasons why we need to educate younger people especially, also educate, provide opportunities for diplomats who will be negotiating various agreements at international multilateral platforms. I would also add that it needs to be firmly linked up with youth engagement and empowerment activities. I think one important element that we see in the disarmament sphere is that how civil society activists moves the file so much. The energy, the voices that civil society people, especially younger people, can bring will give new, innovative, creative forces for disarmament. For that, younger people has to have the knowledge, of course, through the education, but also empowerment opportunities so that they will be leaders of these movements. So for us, the UN, it is one of the top priority issues.
However, my name is Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, and I have a question about research, and it is to any of the panelists, but in particular to Mary Olson, and that is, are we finished with the research on this, or what more needs to be done?
The question of why has not been addressed by anyone. And 8 years ago, I came to the Vienna Conference of 2014. It was a cutting-edge piece of news that there is a difference between a female body and how it is harmed, and a male body and how it is less harmed. So here I am again, 8 years later, and I am so joyful that 3 other speakers mentioned the word gender and gender differences and the relevance to humanitarian impacts. That is movement. But unfortunately, no one else is publishing on this. And I'm an old lady now. I need the young people in this room to get their other colleagues to decide to get their PhD in why is there a difference between a male body and a female body when it comes to ionizing radiation. So no, we are not done. The question of why is wide open. But then beyond that, what does it mean for all of life? What does it mean for our life cycle? The reproductive end of the life cycle is not part of my data. And also beyond our species. How is this impacting our planet? Because the massive testing, over 2,000 detonations, has had an enormous consequence on the entire living fabric of the planet Earth. So enormous amount of work to do. And work, however, that can be taken with hope if we can, in fact, get rid of these weapons.
I thought it was a very interesting panel and good discussion. I hope you share that view. And I wanted to ask you to give a big hand to our panelists. And in the afternoon, we will look at some of the more recent developments and recent research.
Steve Polanyi is a Canadian chemist with European roots who won the 1986 Nobel Prize for his research in chemical kinetics.
The speed of today's changes, as well as the responsibility of scientists for them. With 20 million killed in World War I and 60 million in World War II, mankind showed it could mass produce death. Then A-bombs increased the power of weaponry 1,000-fold, H-bombs by 1,000,000-fold. A turning away from war is evidenced by the decline in interstate violence over the past 3/4 of a century. Objectively, peace seemed to be winning until Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This meeting contemplates the terrible consequences of nuclear war, from which we've been saved for 70 years by no more than a notional taboo. However, the legislation now exists to transform that taboo into law. It is, I hardly need tell you, the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will be the topic over the coming days.
On the environment, on the health, and on our communities, and I think a lot of these themes have already featured quite prominently this morning, and I'm excited to continue the conversation with our great panel we have here this afternoon.
By all other nuclear weapon states, it's we want small weapons that probably we can use, that might be more usable than the other weapons we have in our arsenal. So in my research I was wondering, what is it about these small nuclear weapons? What is it that these are all talking about? And so I'm looking at the humanitarian impact of a single small nuclear weapon. And I think my title gives the findings away, so that's probably too early, but the conclusion basically is there are no small nuclear weapons. If you want to describe weapons that were used, like the weapons in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I would actually have to shrink this. It wouldn't fit on the screen. You have to actually make it smaller because it was 21 kilotons in Nagasaki and 13 kilotons in Hiroshima. And today's arsenals, most weapons actually are even bigger. So they have 100 kilotons and more. So 100 of these dots with 1,000 dots.
What you're about to see is a climate simulation of the aftermath of a nuclear war in which India and Pakistan each used 50 atomic bombs, which is less than half their current arsenal, on each other's cities in a single day. The millions of tons of smoke produced in the region spreads around the globe within days and covers most of the globe within a few weeks, following the same mechanism that would produce a nuclear winter after a larger nuclear war.
The study estimates that global food reserves would be exhausted within a few years and that trade would cease. And the combined effect of this and the climatic change mean that 3.7 billion people would suffer a staple crop production of more than 10%, and 600 million people suffer a staple crop production of more than 30%, and many of them located in the global south.
The issue of global food insecurity is one that is certainly predominating discussions now. The war in Ukraine has amplified those narratives, and certainly the implications for the humanitarian implications are paramount.
Altogether, weapon states conducted more than 2,000 nuclear weapon tests, most of them fortunately underground, but more than 500 were atmospheric tests. And many communities worldwide were directly affected by these tests, and you can see them on this map, so I won't read them all, but highlight perhaps a few. There's Algeria, Australia, Kazakhstan, and especially, of course, communities in the Pacific, the Marshall Islands. We heard about briefly this morning, but also in French Polynesia.
Here today has been a topic of discussion in the media for the last months, and there's a new attention to it. However, the media don't want to take the time or have the time. So I ask you, maybe in your closing remarks, what's your soundbite?
There's no doubt that we're in a completely new environment when it comes to the role of nuclear weapons, the way they're being talked about, the perspectives for future reductions and eventually elimination. I think it's fair to say that the era we have known since the end of the Cold War of significant reductions of nuclear weapons and the role they play is over.
I don't have anything comforting to say before introducing the next speaker, who is Dr. Tutti Raster, Senior Researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And Tutti will speak about how new technological developments bring sort of an added variety of risks to nuclear deterrence.
The belief in the security benefits of nuclear deterrence is based on the assumption that states' behavior is predictable and the related technologies are reliable. And as we have seen already in some of the presentations today, both of these assumptions are problematic. In reality, leaders might not be deterred and nuclear weapons may get used either intentionally, by accident, or as a result of miscalculation or unauthorized use. Nuclear weapons are also not fail-safe, as highlighted by the previous talks, reminding us of the historical record of close calls, those that we know about.
There are lots of plausible ways that things could go bad, that nuclear weapons use could happen. Understanding how those evolve and what their impacts would be is the first step to figuring out how to stop them before they happen. And our goal with this project is to demonstrate that we should be thinking about these possible situations, even if they seem very unlikely.
We live in a system of states, not of peoples. States make war. War makes monsters of people. So our fundamental problem in the nuclear age is the problem of the state. And what do we do as human beings to discipline the structures that have power over us? Because it is the nature of those structures and the lack of accountability of those structures that is our fundamental problem. No country with nuclear weapons has ever asked its people, do you want to be defended by mass murder of others?
In a way, you do highlight the very nature of the humanitarian initiative and the goal it's set out to do, and that's to shift the conversation on nuclear weapons from security blanket and the provider of safety to the actual things that nuclear weapons do when used. And as you said, those are instruments of mass murder.
To meet the obligations of, for example, Articles 6 and 7 in terms of victim assistance, and in particular environmental remediation is a complex problem that will truly take time. So I'm just wondering what you all would think about a timeline, and if a timeline, whether something like 2045 would make sense in your opinion.
Darryl is eager to take the first question, so I'll let you do that if it turns to us.
Well, how about timelines? My timeline is we need to achieve more without nuclear weapons as fast. I think even 2045 is a long way from now. I don't know why 2045 is a particular date that we should be heading towards. So I would just say the goal should be ASAP.
Building security on nuclear deterrence is not sustainable. When nuclear deterrence fails, it will fail with catastrophic effects. Many see a logical problem, how a weapon that threatens the continued existence of civilization could serve as the bedrock of security. The combined perspective of the humanitarian consequences and the risks of nuclear weapons would allow us to tackle the question of the utility of nuclear weapons and of the veracity of nuclear deterrent theory on a more fact-based basis. Only an approach based on scientific results and the involvement of civil society, academia, and affected communities, in particular the Hibakusha and the victims of nuclear testing, can render an open, meaningful disarmament debate leading to concrete results.